Hello. Joining me today is retired Ohio Supreme Court Justice Evelyn Lundberg Stratton. Welcome.
Thank you.
To our reflections. Appointed in 96, retired at the end of 12. Why didn't you run again?
I did 3 statewide races, 2 local races. I didn't think I had it in me to do a 4th, and I had begun working on issues with mental health and criminal justice. That really became my passion, and I decided, there's a lot of people that want my job, but not a lot of people that want to work in this area, so it's time to make a move.
So what are you doing these days?
I have kind of 2 diverse lives. I didn't intend to practice law at all when I left, but some friends came calling, and then some other friends, and then I met with the law firm of Vorey, Sater, Seymour, and Peace. I vetted them. Nobody left the firm. Secretaries didn't leave the firm. They really cared about their people. It was a good atmosphere to work in, and so I started just part-time. I don't give them very many hours because that's not why I left the bench, but I'm basically an appellate coach. I try to make good lawyers better, and I try to tell them how to write briefs that I wanted to read and how to argue cases I wanted to hear.
Okay.
So it's been really, really fun to do that. But the rest of my work is around criminal justice, mental illness, veterans, and youth.
In fact, you do so much appellate work, you're in the best appellate lawyers in America the last few years. Yes?
Yeah,
True?
But I'm very much behind the scenes. I'm not in the public eye at all.
Well, the other thing I found out your time at Vorey's is you're a member of their Autonomous Vehicle Working Group. Is that right?
Well, that's
what is that?
Actually something that I pushed.
Okay.
My first major before I went to law school was nuclear physics. It's a long story how I got to law, but anyhow, I have had the love of science fiction for all my life. I almost exclusively read that for pleasure. And I've been fascinated by these issues, and then I started reading about it, and it's like autonomous vehicles are the wave of the future. Drones are here now. They're being used everywhere in field inspections and bridge inspections, and my son who is
Search warrants.
Search warrants, and my son who's a movie director uses them now instead of helicopters. So I went to the firm about a year and a half ago and I said, we really need to get ahead of the curve. We need to develop a practice in this. Law firms are not very entrepreneurial, so it took a little...
They're not very forward-looking either.
It took a little while, but finally they got the fever and they put together an autonomous vehicle drones section. And we went out to the testing site over at Honda, and I got to ride in one of those cars that automatically stops when you don't brake yourself, and it's fascinating. So we're really trying to develop that area. But it's absolutely not related to anything else I do in my life, except that I think it's fun.
Well, it's just, to me, it was interesting that you were working on that area, because I hadn't heard of any law firm working on that area.
Nope.
You were trial judge, too, before going on the Supreme Court.
I was one of the very first women to try civil lawsuits.
Is that right?
I think the first woman to try a civil lawsuit pregnant. Very interesting experience. Wow. I used it to my full advantage.
Did you win?
Oh, sir, Your Honor, I really need to take a little break. I'm feeling faint. He was going way too long on the other side.
Okay.
Yes, shameless.
Okay. You ever miss being on the court?
I don't. Every stage that I have left, when I left the trial bench, I didn't miss it. When I left the Supreme Court, I didn't miss it. I had done that 16 years. As you know, it's 5 feet of briefs every 2 weeks. If you get an extra week, you get an extra foot at that pile. And I really became so passionate and interested in the mental health work that I thought, it's time for somebody else to do this job, and I want to pursue that.
Well, let's go back a little bit before even trial in Supreme Court. Born in Thailand, missionary parents, spent your childhood in South Vietnam and Malaysia. What was it like? Do you remember anything about South Vietnam during that time?
Very much so. I mean, I was there till 8th grade. To me, it was my normal life. I didn't know anything different. But, when I was born in Bangkok, it was very primitive in the little village we lived, which was 8 hours away by train. So my mom came down by train a couple days before just to have a good hospital in Bangkok that the Seventh-day Adventists ran. It was a good thing she did because I was breech and I had to be C-section, and I would not be here if we had stayed in the little village. And my dad came down by train the day before and fortunately was able to be there. But in those days, we didn't have insurance, and they actually wanted you to pay your bill before you left the hospital, and my parents being missionaries didn't have much money. So my dad sold a tape recorder that we had for the equivalent of $50 US and got me out of the hospital. So I like to say that my life was worth $50 at the time. Yeah, so I lived there for 6 years in the little village called Nong Khai, way up at the Laotian border. But when we were 6 years old, we all were required to go to a mission-run boarding school, which was at that time in South Vietnam. Our parents were not permitted to homeschool. So for 9 months out of each year, I was at a mission-run boarding school with kids from other countries. Like my roommate was a Vietnamese kid and my other roommate was an Indonesian kid. We were all actually Americans, but we all had the culture that we were born and raised in. So it was a very interesting mix. And then the Vietnam War became way too serious. The school had to evacuate. My dad had actually pulled me out the year before because I had to have braces, and there was nowhere in Vietnam to do that. So I lived with the mission family, and when the school evacuated, my dad was in charge, and I joined up with the school in Bangkok for a year. But it was very primitive. We had taken over a thing called the American Club. We had little tiny rooms, so they built triple-decker bunks that could fit 6 of us in a room. They had lean-to shelters over the sidewalks that we went to school in our rubber shoes, because our rubber flippers, because of the flooding. Now you see where my school funding vote maybe came from.
I got you.
But we had totally excellent, dedicated teachers who had come from America. So then they moved the school to Malaysia because it was just too bad an environment in Bangkok. And I spent the last 3 years in the mountains of Malaysia in a beautiful setting for our school.
Do you think that experience affected you in any way while you're on the Supreme Court?
Oh, absolutely. I grew up in countries that didn't have freedom of press or freedom of religion or no democracy. And the things that we just so take for granted, I knew were so precious. And so it helped me in my balancing act when we had, this right versus that right, or this challenge versus that challenge, to have that experience and to say, the things that make this country great are really important to keep strong. Our freedom of press and freedom of religion and freedom of speech. Because once those things start eroding, then you get into the dictatorships that I grew up in.
Now, you get back to the U.S., 18, college. Why'd you go to law school?
It's a funny story. As I said, I started off in nuclear physics. They dropped the program the year I started, and it was a engineering college. It did not have other majors, and I decided I didn't want just physics or chemistry, and then I realized I had this great heritage growing up overseas. So I had 180-degree churn. I was going to go into United Nations work and embassy work, the third culture kid stuff. So I transferred to the University of Florida and decided I wanted to major in international relations. Well, I met my former husband right before I transferred, and his electrical engineering major would transfer to the University of Florida. Well, along the way, he was in this college he was in was 90% men, and they said, you shouldn't be following her around. So he said, if you want to marry me, you have to come back to Texas and go back to the school, which had a 2-person history department. That was the only thing my credits would transfer to. So I chose love over career, and I moved back. And then it was like, if he's not going to follow me to Florida, he's not following me to Thailand or overseas. So what do I do? And I played the piano for a quartet that the school sponsored that, tried to recruit kids, sang in churches and schools and stuff. And my chaperone said, you like to write and you like to act. Why don't you become a lawyer?
Oh, act and write.
None of the save the world stuff.
Okay.
And somewhere concurrent, because I still have this very religious side, came the thought, I want to be a judge. Now, I have no idea what a judge did. I never saw Perry Mason because we didn't have TV until my last year of school, and then we only saw one American show a night. Never saw a judge or a lawyer in Thailand that I was aware of, but it just seemed like something I should do with my life. So from the day I went to law school, I wanted to be a judge.
Wow. I told you before,
Yeah.
It's just the opposite of me. I had no intention.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, how'd you end up at Ohio State then?
Well, we were going to this college in Texas, but he was from Ohio.
Okay.
And it was a private college. And once he got married, his parents said, you're on your own, which they should. And so we were financially unable to pay. And so we moved back. And Ed actually ended up going to Akron to finish my undergrad because Akron would accept you as a resident if you were married to one. OSU would not.
Okay.
So then we moved down here because my first husband got a job at WTVN radio. He was in the radio business. And so I went to law school down here because of that.
Okay. Well, Did you enjoy law school?
I did.
Some
I
do and some don't. Is the
I
reason
was
ask.
married, so I didn't take it quite maybe as seriously as some who have no other life, which a lot of the law students did. But it was a reordering. I mean, I was a straight A student in college, and when I got to law school, my first grade was 34 in contracts. I'm like, this 34 out of 40? No, it's 34 out of 100. I'm like, what? And all of a sudden you realize you're with every other A student, and not all the A students anymore. So I was not top of my class, but neither did I want law school to be my entire life. But I did okay.
Then what?
Then I couldn't get a job. Nobody was hiring women.
Women at the time.
I can tell you a whole lot of stories, but there's for another time and place, but I couldn't get a job. I got a job as a law clerk. They couldn't decide to hire me as an attorney. I finally got a job with a firm that did take a chance and hire me as an attorney, but then they couldn't make me a partner, and things like that went on. And finally, I just tried never to burn bridges. I just tried to do the best I could. And the very first firm I worked at, several of the lawyers had left that were doing the business litigation part, and they wanted a new partner. And so 6 years later, they called me up out of the blue, right when my firm that I was with had one partner that didn't want a woman. Okay. And so the whole thing was a big mess. And they called me up and said, we don't know how to approach you on this, but are you interested in maybe talking about coming and joining us? And if I'd burned that bridge, maybe I wouldn't have had that opportunity. So I joined my new firm, which was West Wosterkamp and Stratton. Okay. And had no issues with discrimination anymore with that group, loved it, and was there till I ran for judge.
How long between passing the bar and running for judge?
I was in practice 9 years.
9 years, okay.
Now, I'm a long-term planner, so I had a 5, 10, 15, 20-year goal,
okay.
And in 20 years I wanted to be a judge because all the judges I knew were in their 50s and 60s. But because I was doing all these things in my methodical planning way to get there, I ended up getting a chance to run for, actually I had to run against an incumbent. And I wasn't appointed, I ran. I was one woman and 5 men that were running on the Republican ticket at that point. Or
in the primary?
Yeah. No, actually that was in the general.
Oh, in the general. Okay.
Yeah, but I took out the incumbent and became a judge.
It's hard to do, but I've done it, and it's not fun.
Well, I was 34. I was the youngest by 10 years, the only one with small children, and the only woman. And I had another whole series of interesting experiences. Yeah.
Okay, so you're 7 years trial judge. Why run for the Supreme Court?
I didn't plan to.
Or technically appointed, but
yeah, but I was going to the federal court. That was my next 5-year game plan, 10-year game plan. I was doing, you're appointed, you get more money, bigger.
Don't have to run again?
Don't have to run again. So I was headed that direction and trying to put everything in place for that. And I got a call out of the blue that Justice Craig Wright was retiring, and would I consider an appointment to that spot? And I was like, okay. I had just met my second husband. I had not married him yet. My first husband left me 6 months after I was elected, so I'm like Pavlov response. Run for office, get elected, lose husband. I haven't even married this guy yet. What do I do? I mean, I just won an election for a second time. I have a 6-year term ahead of me. But I thought, if you're appointed, even though I was appointed in March and I had to run in November, so I had no preparation. I had not planned that route. I thought, well, this seems like what the good Lord wants me to do. So I took a chance. I talked to my now husband because the appointment was coming up in March, and I got married to him in September. And he said, go for it, absolutely, I'll be behind you. And he had never been married, so he had no idea that a marriage consisted of your wife meeting some stranger, driving around the counties for a day and coming home at midnight for a year and a half. And because he had no expectations, it ended up working out all right. But yeah, so I didn't plan that route.
So you literally got married in the middle of the campaign.
Right before the campaign, and
right.
All the interviewing and stuff was already happening.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, share with us some of your best memories on the court.
First of all, I had wonderful colleagues, as you know, and you get to have wonderful friendships. But also the campaigning process is one, I frankly was a person that loved campaigning because I love people, and I made so many friends. And what I ended up doing is making the campaign. Well, as a justice, you're boring as a campaigner. You can't talk about anything. It's like, well, I can't tell you that. I can't give you my opinion on that, or I won't give you my opinion on it. Well, with mental health and criminal justice work, I could talk about it because it was the administration of justice, which you're allowed to do.
Correct.
So every campaign speech was about that. Every campaign speech was about training police officers called crisis intervention teams. And because of that, and because you give hundreds of speeches, you have a chance to really push the agenda on
Sure.
that, and that was really wonderful. And then I really enjoyed the legal process. I've seen other justices you've interviewed talk about this too, but when you're a trial judge, you're making decisions really quick and occasionally get appealed, but most of the time you don't. And you have nobody else to bounce it off on most of the time. And on the Supreme Court, it's like you have the luxury to think about it and hear other people's opinions. And sometimes somebody will say something that's like, oh, I never thought of that angle. And that's really right. And then sometimes when you're in the minority and you're so convinced you're right, it's so frustrating because you can't get that fourth vote for your viewpoint.
Right.
So I really enjoyed that give and take process.
I have to say, what I've learned, and you can tell me if you believe it, is that time to think is so different than in practice.
Oh my God, yes.
The practitioners, I mean, when I was practitioner, client wanted to know right then.
Yep.
Do you think that makes us too slow in the judicial system? In the modern, everything has to be done today world?
I think that most judges should think faster and get their opinions out sooner, because I think that there's way too much delay. It's valuable to have the time to think, but when I was a trial judge, I ruled from the bench. I would go back, I would say, okay, I'm going to take it under advisement. I'd go back and sit in my office, just like a juror, and I would consider my decision, and I would go out on the bench the same day and give my opinion. Very few judges do that, but lawyers loved it because they got their opinion right away. It came from the judge rather than having to explain to your client why the judge ruled against him.
And the party's there.
The parties are there, and they can clear up any well, Your Honor, you left this point out. Oh, okay, let me take. And so that's how I practiced when I was a judge. And I was pretty prompt on getting my opinions out when I was on the bench.
Now, during your tenure, there were 4 cases known as Roth, and today, still on the campaign circuit, we still get asked about Roth. Tell me about your feelings about the funding of the state
Roth
education.
was an interesting mix that I think a lot of people don't really understand. They all talk about it be about school funding. Well, school funding is not something that we as judges have the right to tell, in my opinion, the legislature how to do. Because do you take the funding from the program for pregnant women? Do you take the funding from the roads? It's a balancing act. But when I looked at all of the evidence, 90% of the evidence we had was all about buildings and supplies. The teachers were pretty well paid compared to the national average. There was no complaints about the teacher pay and that. So the allocations that the schools made was to keep the teachers happy, keep them funded, probably because they had unions to deal with, and the buildings were in disarray. Well, the decisions that we made ended up in the school funding for the buildings project. And everywhere I went when I started campaigning again after that, you saw beautiful new buildings. So in my opinion, what the case really focused on got fixed. The fundamental issue of how you fund them, to me, is not an issue a court should decide. It's a policy decision because it involves so many factors to look at.
Now, I do, on a somewhat serious but also interesting note, I want to hear, because I've got 2 versions that I've found, the story of Violet Moon.
Well, my parents went out to Thailand in 1950. Now, my dad was he was a farmer from Minnesota, but he was one of the 5 brothers that volunteered to go. One of the 5 had to go to war in World War II. And when he was in World War II, he was stationed in New Hebrides Islands. He was a bomb demolition expert, and he became a Christian, and he got to know some missionaries, so he wanted to become a missionary. So when he came back after the war, he went to a Bible college in Nyack, New York. That was the Christian Missionary Alliance Bible College, Nyack Bible College. My mother was raised in Long Island. She was very involved in the Salvation Army as a child, and she worked in a Grumman air factory making airplane parts during the war. And then she decided she wanted to go to Bible college. She was offered a supervisor position after the war, but she decided she wanted to follow her heart. So they met at college, And our mission required them to serve 2 years as pastor, under the theory if you didn't make it as a pastor, you weren't going to make it as a missionary. So they sent them to a church in Prattville, Alabama.
Oh, wow.
And my dad made $50 a week.
It's a lot different than Minnesota.
Yep. Oh, my God, there was a culture shock for them. But the mission said you had to raise $1,000 for your passage to Thailand, which was by boat then. That's a lot of money on $50. So my mom just believed in prayer. She started praying. And one day a woman from Toledo, Ohio, sent her a check for $1,000. Had picked her from a list of candidates that their church had sent them from candidates to the mission field, and sent my parents this check for $1,000, which gave them their passage to Thailand, having no idea that their daughter would one day come back to Ohio. So that's how they got to Thailand. And I never knew about that and never heard about it. So when I came back to America, eventually I ended up in Ohio, and went to the the Christian Missionary Alliance Church here in Ohio, on Henderson Road, and did a lot of wills and estate planning for people in my church. And I had a little old lady named Ethel Morris that needed a will, so I did it for her. And then she came in one day and she was very distraught. And I said, "What is wrong, Ethel?" She said, "I have a sister named Violet Moon, and she has this brain condition. She has to have surgery, but they've canceled her insurance, and we don't know what we're going to do." So I said, well, let me get into this. So I talked to the insurance company, the doctor, the hospital, and I found out that short-term memory loss was a true medical side effect of this brain condition. So the insurance company agreed to reinstate her insurance if we paid the back premium. So we did. And Violet was able to go forward and have her surgery. It was very successful. So my mom and dad tend to stay in Florida on furloughs. They get a furlough once every 5 years. So I got to see them once every 5 years once I came back to America. But they come up to visit, and people from my church always wanted to meet my missionary parents. So I called up Ethel because she was elderly. I said, "Can you get Violet Moon and come to church on Sunday because Mom and Dad are coming and they want to meet you?" So she called up Violet and said, "Eve Stratton's parents are coming to church on Sunday. Would you go with me?" And Violet said, "Oh, I know a lot of missionaries. I love missionaries. What are their names?" She said, "Their names are Corrine and Elmer Sahlberg." And there was a pause, and then Violet said, "That's very strange. 35 years ago, my husband and I gave $1,000 to Corrine and Elmer Sahlberg to go to Thailand."
That is isn't that amazing?
So I happen to think that's why I'm here. That's why I have this job. That's why I have this mission, because of that check.
That's one of the great stories, at least to me, I've heard on all this, because it just takes the whole thing.
Yep, could not be
circles.
just coincidence.
No. I do want to know about the Stampede Girls goat tying competition you won.
Well, as I said, I was at this college that was basically 90% men, because it was engineering. In those days, not many women went into that field. I was in nuclear physics there. And they have, it's a Christian college, so instead of a dance, because a lot of Christians believe dance is evil, you lust and things like that. So I was never allowed to dance growing up in Thailand at a missionary boarding school. But I love to dance. So they had a rodeo instead. And because it was Texas, the college was in Texas, that fit too. So they had all these events, and they had just a couple for women. And they had the girls goat tying contest. But they couldn't get enough women to join it. So they asked me, and I'm like, okay, I've ridden elephants. I can handle a goat. So I said, what do I have to do? They said, well, you have to run out. You have to chase it down. You have to throw it down. You tie 3 legs together and put your hands up. So I never had practiced. I just did it. I went out, threw it down, tied the legs, raised my hand. Apparently did it faster than anybody else. And I have literally a gold goat sitting in my office.
Oh, that's great.
Mm-hmm. I put that on my resume, my second campaign.
Yeah.
It was the most talked about thing. None of the other accomplishments matter a whit, but that goat tying, by golly, they talk about that.
Absolutely.
It's a fun little thing.
Well, let's change a little bit further. What do you see as the biggest or newest trend emerging in the court system?
I think the declining access to justice, the declining ability to try cases, I know it concerns the bar as a whole. It concerns me because when I was a trial lawyer, I tried a case 2-3 times a month. And now you'll talk to lawyers, and they're lucky if they get 1 trial a year. But sometimes you need those trials. You need the jury to sort things out. You need that. And settlements sometimes are forced on you because of the economics rather than because of the right thing to do and the justice of it. So I'm really concerned about that. And I'm really concerned that people who don't have income and have means don't have the ability to access justice. I know the court's doing an access to
Trying.
justice project, but there's there's a threat now to cut the funding again for legal aid, and that's an ongoing battle. Everybody needs legal representation, and so I'm a big proponent that the Bar Association, the lawyers have a ticket to a monopoly, and because of that, they have a duty to give back, and they have a duty to serve and duty to do pro bono.
Is it more difficult to be a judge today than when you started as a judge?
I don't know. It's more difficult to be a Supreme Court justice because you have that public scrutiny that you don't have as a trial judge, and you're making policy decisions. So one side hates you and one side loves you, and so I think it's much more difficult on that stage that you're in now than it was as a trial judge. But overall, I don't necessarily think so.
Okay. One of those letters to yourself, what would you have written today if you knew now what you didn't know then?
I don't know that I would have changed anything. I'm pretty happy with the path my life took. I always am trying to work less, but never succeeding. And I don't know that I would have, if I told my younger self to do that, it would have done any good. Because it's not doing any good now.
But
No,
I think
but
it seems like you enjoy what you're doing.
I love what I'm doing.
Now, when you're not doing all that, I understand you paint a little
Yes.
bit. What type of painting?
I do a lot of realistic paintings. I have a picture in my office that's a leopard drinking water at night. Do a lot of sunsets. My husband calls it the dark period.
Okay.
I have a lot of sunsets with different scenes. I do a lot of that. I just have fun doing it.
Would you do your own portrait for the
No,
court?
I'm not good at people. I don't paint people very well.
I also understand you're a fly fisherman or fly fisherwoman.
Yeah, fisherman's fine.
Okay.
Yes.
Where do you fish a lot?
Well, my husband and I have kind of fished all over. We've been in Costa Rica, we've been in Chile, we have a place now in Montana. We fish
Okay.
when we go out there. Been to Michigan.
Oh, wow.
Several
all
places,
over.
yeah.
Your law clerks told me I need to ask you certain things.
Uh-oh. They know me too well.
I don't know if it's your lack or greatness in driving directional prowess.
I have gotten, GPS is the world's greatest invention. Let me put it that way.
Okay.
I also discovered that somebody named my condition, one of the lawyers I was doing a case with recently, and I love it. I've got directional dyslexia. Okay. I will turn left instead of right. I will end up in London instead of Logan. Yes, I'm pretty famous for that. Even now, I hire a friend of mine to drive me when I go around the state and do this stepping up work on mental health. I have someone drive me because I'm dangerous.
That's okay.
I freely admit
ask
it.
about her driving. The other thing they talked about is how you allowed them or gave a little push for them to get involved with projects. Mm-hmm. Why?
Because being a law clerk is a very isolated job, as you know. Just like being a justice is a very isolated job. You just sit in your cubicle and read or sit at home and read. And I thought it was important for their sense of value and self-worth for them to also be involved in things. And I wanted to encourage them to do that. So I did, yes.
Now, in terms of serving on the Ohio Supreme Court, what would you want your legacy to be?
That you got an opinion that was common sense based in precedent and law, and hopefully got to the right moral conclusion as well.
What advice would you have for a newly minted judge or attorney?
Well, I have a 10 tips for success I always give as a speech. It's in
And I've got it right
it's
here.
in that article I gave you. There needs to be, get off your iPad, get off your iPhone, reconnect with people. Go to lunches, sit down and talk to them, get to know them. I mean, I used to invite my opponents out to lunch when I was a young lawyer. Boy, that threw them. And I said, I just want to get to know you because we were fighting tooth and nail. And when you get to know them, you still fight hard for your client, but the nastiness is gone because now you know this person. So I think the internet has been a blessing and a curse at the same time. I would you get 40, 50 emails a day now, whereas before you never would talk to somebody 40 or 50 times a day or open 40 or 50 letters. But by the same token, it's cut down on the human interaction, which I think is very important, and for lawyers and judges. I mean, judges, I think, should get out of their ivory tower, go to bar association events. Go. You were. I'm preaching to the choir here. You were heavily involved, but that's important to keep you connected to real life.
Well, thank you
Well, thank
for your
you.
time. Glad you did this.
And thank you for taking on this project.